We are reading The 100 Years War on Palestine by Rashid, Khalidi. We are on page 216. Yasser Arafat died in November 2004 in a Paris hospital in circumstances that have remained murky. Mahmoud Abbas, Abu Mazen, replaced him as head of the PLO and Fatah and was elected to the presidency of the PA for a 4-year term in January 2005. No presidential election has been held since then, so Abbas has ruled without a democratic mandate from 2009 on. Arafat's death marked the passing of an era, a half-century that began in the early 1950s, with the first stirrings of a revived national movement, and ended with Palestinian fortunes at their lowest ebb since 1948. Over the succeeding decade and a half, Abbas presided ineffectually over a grave deterioration in the already weakened state of the national movement, an intensification of inter-Palestinian conflict, a substantial expansion of Zionist colonization of what remained of Palestine, and a series of Israeli wars on an increasingly besieged Gaza Strip. One of the few surviving members of the old guard of the Fatah Central Committee that had long dominated the PLO, Abbas was neither charismatic nor eloquent. He was not renowned for personal bravery or considered a man of the people. Overall, he was one of the least impressive of the early generation, of prominent Fatah leaders. While a few of this group died of natural causes, many of them, Abu Uyad, Abu Jihad, Sayyid Sael, Abu al-Walid, Majid Abu Sharar, Abu Yusuf Najjar, Kamal Adwan, Hayal Abd al-Hamid, Abu al-Hal, and Abu Hassan Salameh, had been killed by assassins of the Mossad or of groups backed by the Syrian, Iraqi, and Libyan regimes. With Ghassan Kanafani and Kamal Nasser, they had been among the movement's best and most effective leaders and spokespersons, and their loss left the Palestinians with a less dynamic and feebler organization. Israel's systematic liquidations under the rubric of targeted killings continued throughout the Second Intifada and during the Abbas years, as Fatah, PFLP, Hamas, and Islamic Jihad leaders were also killed. That some of these assassinations were driven by political rather than military or security considerations was made clear with the killing of Ismail Abu Shanab, for example, who was a vocal opponent within Hamas of suicide bombings. Nicholas Pelham and Max Rodenbeck, Which Way for Hamas? New York Review of Books, November 5th, 2009. The ongoing war on Gaza, which included major Israeli ground offenses in 2008, 2009, 2012, 2014, was combined with regular Israeli military incursions into Palestinian areas of the West Bank and East Jerusalem. These involved arrests and assassinations, the demolition of homes, and the suppression of the population, all of which took place with the quiet collusion of the Fatah-run PA in Ramallah. These events confirmed that the PA was a body with no sovereignty and no authority except that allowed it by Israel, as it collaborated in quashing protests in the West Bank while Israel pounded Gaza. Hamas and Islamic Jihad had boycotted the presidential election of 2005, as they had earlier PA elections, in line with their rejection of the Oslo process and of the Palestinian Authority and the Palestinian Legislative Assembly that had emerged from it. Soon after, however, Hamas performed a surprising U-turn, deciding to run a slate of candidates in the parliamentary elections in January 2006. In its campaign, the organization downplayed the socially conservative Islamist message that had been its trademark, as well as its advocacy of armed resistance to Israel, instead emphasizing reform and change, which was the name of its electoral list. This was a reversal of great significance. By fielding candidates for the assembly, Hamas not only accepted the PA's legitimacy, but also, by extension, the legitimacy of the negotiating process that had produced it, and of the two-state solution that it was meant to lead to. Moreover, Hamas was also embracing the possibility of winning the elections, thus sharing responsibility for government, the PA, together with Abbas. The PA's core responsibilities, as seen by its Israeli, American, and European sponsors, involve preventing violence against Israelis and security cooperation with Israel. Hamas had never conceded that this shift indeed meant what it seemed to mean, or that it contradicted the commitment to armed resistance that was its raison d'etre and part of its name, of which Hamas was an acronym, the Islamic Resistance Movement. Against all exceptions, including its own, Hamas won the elections by a handsome margin. It took 74 seats to Fatah's 45 in a 132-member assembly. Although with the peculiarities of the electoral system, it had won only 44% of the vote to Fatah's 41%. Exit polls after the vote showed that the result owed more to the voters' great desire for change in the occupied territories than to a call for Islamist governance or heightened armed resistance to Israel. This was clearly shown by polling done after the election by the reputable Palestine Center for Policy and Survey Research and by a private firm, Near East Consulting. Even in some predominantly Christian neighborhoods, the vote went heavily for Hamas. This is evidence that many voters simply wanted to throw out the Fatah incumbents whose strategy had failed and who were seen as corrupt and unresponsive to popular demands. With Hamas in control of the Legislative Assembly, conflict between Fatah and Hamas escalated. As a range of Palestinian political figures recognized, a split between the two movements was potentially disastrous for the Palestine cause, a sentiment that was strongly supported by public opinion. In May 2006, the 5 leaders of the major groups held in Israeli prison camps, including Fatah, Hamas, the PFLP, and Islamic Jihad, issued the prisoners' document, which deserves to be more widely known. It called for an end to the rupture between the factions on the basis of a new program whose cornerstone was a two-state solution. The document was a major event. The final revised revision, agreed to by all Palestinian factions, dated June 28, 2006, can be found here. A clear statement of the wishes of the rank and file of both groups, the most respected elements of which, those who had not been assassinated, were held in Israeli prisons. The regard for prisoners in Palestinian society is very high, and over 400,000 Palestinians have been incarcerated by Israel since the occupation began. Under this pressure from below, Hamas and Fatah repeatedly tried to form a coalition government of members of both parties. These efforts ran into fierce opposition from Israel and the United States, which rejected Hamas as part of any PA government. They insisted on explicit recognition of Israel, rather than the implicit form embodied in the prisoners' document, as well as a variety of other conditions. Thus, Hamas was now drawn into the same interminable dance around concessions that the PLO had been forced to endure for decades. Whether the demand was that it amend its charter, agree to UN Resolution 242, renounce terrorism, or accept Israel's existence, all to gain legitimation by those imposing the conditions. Whether the demands were made of the PLO in the 1970s or Hamas in the 2000s, they were required without the offer of any quid pro pro by the power that had expelled much of the Palestinian people, blocked their return, occupied their territory through force and collective intimidation, and prevented their self-determination. While Israel vetoed the inclusion of Hamas in a PA coalition, the United States subjected Hamas to a boycott. Congress exercised the power of the pursuit to prevent U.S. funding from going to Hamas or any PA body of which it was part. Funding sources for the Palestinians, such as the Ford Foundation, forced a variety of NGOs to jump through legally imposed hoops to ensure that no support went to any project even remotely connected to Hamas. Abraham Foxman, head of the fiercely pro-Israel Anti-Defamation League, was even brought in to vet the Palestinian recipients of Ford's largest say. The result was predictable. Ford effectively ceased to fund Palestinian NGOs, which precisely served Israel's goals. Meanwhile, under the USA Patriot Act 2001, quote, material support for terrorism, unquote, was so broadly defined in the Palestinians' case that almost any contact with an organization associated with a group that was placed on the blacklist, as Hamas and the PFLP could be considered a serious criminal act involving heavy penalties. The demonization of the PLO over the decades since the 1960s was now repeated with Hamas. Yet even with the suicide bombings, with targeting civilians in violation of international law, and with the crude anti-Semitism of its charter, Hamas's record paled next to the massive toll of Palestinian civilian casualties inflicted by Israel and its elaborate structures of legal discrimination and military rule. But it was Hamas that was stuck with the terrorist label, and the weight of the U.S. law was applied to the Palestinian side of the conflict alone. In light of this relentless campaign, the breakdown of attempts to fashion a compromise coalition government, in spite of the popular demand for Palestinian national reconciliation, should have come as no surprise. The pressure exerted by Western and Arab funders on Fatah to shun Hamas proved too great for the old Fatah hands in the Palestinian Authority, who did not want to give up their power or the considerable material benefits they had enjoyed in the gilded bubble of Ramallah. They preferred a ruinous split in the Palestinian polity to holding out against a much stronger foe and risking their privileges. What was surprising, however, was the botched attempt of the U.S.-trained, Fatah-controlled security forces in the Gaza Strip under their commander Mohammed Dahlan to unseat Hamas by force. In 2007, Hamas carried out a counter-coup, quickly overwhelmed Dahlan's forces in the ensuing bitter fighting. The Great Gulf between the two sides, going back to the Fatah-dominated repression of Hamas in the 1990s, was now widened further by the blood that was shed copiously on both sides in the Gaza Strip. Hamas proceeded to set up its own Palestine Authority in Gaza, while the jurisdiction of the Ramallah-based PA, such as it was, shrunk, extending to less than 20% of the West Bank, the area in which the Israeli military allowed it to operate. Absurdly, the Palestinians under occupation now not one largely powerless authority, but two. With Hamas now in control of the Gaza Strip, Israel imposed a full-blown siege. Goods entering the Strip were reduced to a bare minimum. Regular exports were stopped completely. Fuel supplies were cut, and leaving and entering Gaza were only rarely permitted. Gaza was in effect turned into an open-air prison, where by 2018, at least 53% of some 2 million Palestinians lived in a state of poverty. This figure is from June 2018. And unemployment stood at an astonishing 52%, with much higher rates for youth and women. This figure is from the Israeli NGO Gisha. CIA World Fact Book estimates for 2016 and 17 are lower. What had begun with international refusal to recognize Hamas's election victory had led to a disastrous Palestinian rupture and the blockade of Gaza. The sequence of events amounted to a new declaration of war on the Palestinians. It also provided indispensable international cover for the open warfare that was to come. Israel was able to exploit the deep division among Palestinians and Gaza's isolation to launch 3 savage air and ground assaults on the Strip that began in 2008 and continued in 2012 and 2014, leaving large swaths of its cities and refugee camps in rubble and struggle with rolling blackouts and contaminated water. 2 excellent books on the Gaza wars are Norman Finkelstein, Gaza, An Inquest into Its Martyrdom, Oakland, University of California Press, 2018, and Noam Chomsky and Ilyan Pape, Gaza in Crisis, Reflections on the U.S.-Israeli War on the Palestinians, Chicago Haymarket Books, 2018. Some neighborhoods, such as Sharjah and parts of Rafah, suffered extraordinary levels of destruction. The casualty figures tell only a part of the story, although they are revealing. In these 3 major attacks, 3,804 Palestinians were killed, of them almost 1,000 minors. A total of 87 Israelis were killed. The majority of them, military personnel engaged in these offensive operations. The lopsided 43-to-1 scale of these casualties is telling, as is the fact that the bulk of the Israelis killed were soldiers while most of the Palestinians were civilians. These figures are taken from the website B'Tselem, the Israeli Information Center for Human Rights in the Occupied Territories. One might not have known this, however, from much of the mainstream U.S. media coverage, which focused heavily on Hamas and Islamic Jihad rocket fire at Israeli civilian targets. Certainly, the use of these weapons obliged the Israeli population in the south of the country to spend long periods of time in bomb shelters. However, thanks to Israel's excellent early warning system, its state-of-the-art American-supplied anti-missile capabilities, and its network of shelters, the rockets were very rarely lethal. In 2014, The 4,000 rockets that Israel claimed were fired from the Gaza Strip killed 5 Israeli civilians. One of them, Budain, or Bedouin, in the Negev region, and a Thai agricultural worker, for a total of 6 civilian deaths. Quote, 50 days, more than 500 children. Facts and figures on fatalities in Gaza, summer 2014, unquote. Bestelem. This does not mitigate Hamas's violation of the rules of war by using these imprecise weapons for indiscriminate attacks on civilian areas. But the casualty toll tells a different story than the one that emerged from the near-total media focus on Hamas rocket fire. The coverage succeeded in obscuring the extreme disproportionality of this one-sided war. One of the most powerful armies on the planet used its full might against a besieged area of 140 square miles, which is among the world's most heavily populated enclaves and whose people no way to escape the rain of fire and steel. Specific details of the 2014 assault underline this point. Over a period of 51 days in July and August of 2014, Israel's Air Force launched more than 6,000 air attacks, while its Army and Navy fired about 50,000 artillery and tank shells. Together, they utilized what has been estimated as a total of 21,000 tons, or 42 million pounds of high explosives. The air assault involved weapons ranging from armed drones and American Apache helicopters firing US-made Hellfire missiles to American F-16 and F-15 fighter bombers carrying 2,000-pound bombs. According to the commander of the Israeli Air Force, there were several hundred attacks by such advanced aircraft on targets in Gaza, most of them using these powerful bombs. Barbara Opal Rome, quote, Gaza war leaned heavily on F-16 close-up air support, unquote. Defense News, September 15, 2014. Support also available. Excuse me. Excuse me again. The explosion of a 2,000-pound bomb produces a crater that is roughly 50 feet wide and 36 feet deep, and sends lethal fragments to a radius of almost a quarter mile. One or two such bombs can destroy an entire multi-story building, many of which were leveled in Gaza City toward the conclusion of the Israeli air campaign at the end of August. Jody Ruderin and Faraz Akram, quote, lost homes and dreams at Tower Israel leveled, unquote. New York Times, September 15, 2014. There is no public record of exactly how many of these monsters were dropped on the Gaza Strip, or whether even heavier ordnance was used. In addition to aerial bombardment, according to a report issued by the Israeli Logistical Command in mid-August 2014, well before the final ceasefire took hold on August 26th, 49,000 artillery and tank shells were fired into the Gaza Strip. Quote, protective edge in numbers, unquote. Ynet, August 14, 2014. Most by the US-made M109A5 155 milliliter howitzer. Its 98-pound shells have a kill zone of about 54 yards radius. It's a football field. say football field. I'm sorry. I'm sorry. And inflict casualties within a diameter of 218 yards. Israel possesses 600 of these artillery pieces and 175 of the longer range American M107 175 millimeter gun, which fires even heavier shells weighing over 145 pounds. One instance of Israel's use of these lethal battlefield weapons suffices to show the vast disproportionality of the war on Gaza. On July 19th through 20th, 2014, elements of the elite Golani, Javati, and paratrooper brigades launched an assault along 3 axes into the Shuja'iyya district of Gaza City. The Golani Brigade, in particular, met fierce and unexpected resistance that resulted in the death of 13 Israeli soldiers and perhaps 100 wounded. According to American military sources, 11 Israeli artillery battalions, employing at least 258 of these 155 millimeter and 175 millimeter guns, fired over 7,000 shells into this single neighborhood over a period of 24 hours. This included 4,800 shells during one 7-hour period. A senior Pentagon officer, quote, with access to the daily briefings, unquote, called the scale of firepower, quote, massive, unquote, and, quote, deadly, unquote, noting that the U.S. Army would normally use so, quote, huge, unquote, an amount of shell fire in support of 2 entire divisions comprising 40,000 troops, perhaps 10 times the size of the Israeli force engaged in Shuja'iyya. Another, a former American artillery commander, estimated that the U.S. military would employ that number of guns only in support of an Army Corps of several divisions. A retired American general described the Israeli bombardment used to pound one Gaza neighborhood for over 24 hours, along with tank fire and attacks from the air as, quote, absolutely disproportionate, unquote. Mark Perry, quote, why Israel's bombardment of Gaza neighborhood left U.S. officials, quote, stunned, unquote, unquote. Al Jazeera, America, August 27th, 2014. The artillery pieces that were used in this assault are designed for lethal area fire over a wide radius against fortifications, armed vehicles, and dug-in troops protected by body armor and helmets. While they can launch precision-guided munitions, deployed as they were against a dense neighborhood such as Shuja'iyya, they were inherently imprecise, and any airstrike dropping 2,000-pound bombs in built-up areas, which Shuja'iyya, Beit Hanun, Khan Yunis, and Rafah are, will necessarily, inevitably, cause heavy civilian casualties and massive damage. In, quote, why it's hard to believe Israel's claim that it did its best to minimize civilian casualties, unquote, the World Post, August 21st, 2014, Iran Berir, a former crew commander in the Israeli Artillery Corps, notes that, quote, the truth is artillery shells cannot be aimed precisely and are not meant to hit specific targets. A standard 40-kilogram shell is nothing but a large fragmentation grenade. When it explodes, it is meant to kill anyone within a 50-meter radius and to wound anyone within a further 100 meters, unquote. And that is Israel's use of artillery fire is a deadly game of Russian roulette. The statistics on which such firepower relies mean that in densely populated areas such as Gaza, civilians will inevitably be hit as well, unquote. They cannot but do so. This is especially true in a place as overcrowded as the Gaza Strip, where people have nowhere to flee even if they are given prior notice that their homes are about to be destroyed. Beyond the horrific injuries they inflict on human flesh, air bombardment and artillery fire on this scale cause unimaginable destruction to property. In the 2014 assaults, over 16,000 buildings were rendered uninhabitable, including entire neighborhoods. A total of 277 UN and government schools, 17 hospitals and clinics, and all 6 of Gaza's universities were damaged, as were over 40,000 other buildings. Perhaps 450,000 Gazans, about a quarter of the population, were forced to leave their home, and many of them no longer had a home to go back to afterward. I misread that. Perhaps 450,000 Gazans, about a quarter of the population, were forced to leave their homes. Many of them no longer had homes to go back to afterward. These were not random occurrences, nor was this regrettable collateral damage often lamented during a war. The weapons chosen were lethal, meant for employment on an open battlefield, not in a heavily populated urban environment. Moreover, the scale of the onslaught was entirely in keeping with Israeli military doctrine. The killing and mangling in 2014 of some 13,000 people, most of them civilians, and the destruction of their homes and property of hundreds of thousands was intentional, the fruit of an explicit strategy adopted by the Israeli military, at least since 2006, when it used such tactics in Lebanon. The Dahiya Doctrine, as it is called, is named for the southern suburb of Beirut, Al-Dahiya, which was destroyed by Israel's Air Force using 2,000-pound bombs and the other ordnance. This strategy was explained in 2008 by Maj, General Gadi Eisenach, and then head of Northern Command, and thereafter Israeli Chief of Staff. What happened in the Dahiya quarter will happen in every village from which Israel is fired on. We will apply disproportionate force on it and cause great damage and destruction there. From our standpoint, these are not civilian villages, they are military bases. This is not a recommendation, this is a plan, and it has been approved. Quote, Israel warns Hezbollah war would invite destruction, unquote. YNetNews.com, October 3rd, 2008. See also Yeron, London, quote, the Dahiya strategy, unquote, YNetNews.com, October 6, 2008. This was precisely the thinking in 2014 behind Israel's third attack on Gaza in a period of 6 years, according to Israeli military correspondents and security analysts. E.g. Amos Harel, quote, a real war is underway in Gaza, unquote, Haaretz, July 26, 2014. Yet, there was little mention of the Dahiya doctrine in statements by U.S. politicians or in the reporting on the war by most of the mainstream American media, even though it is, in fact, less of a strategic approach than a blueprint for collective punishment which entails probable war crimes. There are a number of reasons for the silence of Washington and the media. The Arms Export Control Act of 1976 specifies that American-supplied weapons must be used, quote, for legitimate self-defense, unquote. 36. 22 U.S.C. 2754, purposes for which military sales or releases by the United States are authorized. Report to Congress. Given this provision, the line offered by U.S. officials from the President down, describing Israel's operations in Gaza as self-defense, may be the product of legal advice to avoid liability and potential prosecution for war crimes, alongside the Israeli officials who issued the orders and the soldiers who dropped the bombs. The media, too, rarely mentions this important legal consideration, possibly out of bias or to protect the politicians who would otherwise be implicated, or to dodge the attacks on the media that generally follow even the mildest criticism of Israel. There remains the issue of proportionality, which is central to determining whether certain acts of war rise to the level of war crimes. Eisenkot's own words and the actions of the forces under his command in 2006 are thereafter these attacks on Gaza seem clearly to establish intentional disproportionality on the part of Israel. This is born out of the nature of the battlefield weaponry used by Israel in heavily populated urban areas, and the gross disproportion in firepower between the two sides. Were Hamas and Islamic Jihad also responsible for potential war crimes by targeting a civilian population? Leaving aside the vital distinction between force employed by an occupying force, leaving aside the vital distinction between force employed by an occupying army and that utilized by groups among the occupied people, all combatants are required to obey the laws of war and other provisions of international law. Deadly though the rockets fired into southern Israel could be, few of them had sophisticated guidance systems and none were precision-guided munitions. Thus, their use was generally indiscriminate and could be considered to have been aimed at civilians in large proportion of cases. However, none of the rockets had a warhead or the size or lethality of the over 49,000 tank and artillery shells fired by Israel in 2014. The Soviet-designed 122mm Grad, or Katyusha, rocket, commonly used by Hamas and its allies, normally carried either a 44 or 66-pound warhead, compared with a 96-pound, 155mm shells. Although many were fitted with smaller warheads to increase their range. Most of the homemade Qassam rockets that were used by considerably smaller warheads. Together, the 4,000 Qassam, Katyusha, Grad, and other missiles that were fired from the Gaza Strip and that reached Israel, many were so precise and poorly manufactured that they fell short and landed within the Strip, would have likely had less explosive power in total than a dozen 2,000-pound bombs. While the rain of missiles launched by Hamas and its allies undoubtedly had a potent psychological effect on civilians within its range, the effect is paradoxically heightened by their inaccuracy. These weapons were not terribly powerful. Still, the death of several dozen civilians in Israel over the years from 2008 to 2014 very likely rises to the level of war crimes. What then of the killing in 2014 alone of at least 2,000 civilians not engaged in combat, including some 1,300 women, children, and old people? Several years after the last of these wars on Gaza, it is clear that those responsible, protected by the American patrons, are likely to enjoy impunity for their actions. The savage disproportionality did register in some quarters, however. While hardcore support for Israel solidified among certain groups as a result of the mainstream coverage of 2014 bombardment, Christian evangelicals and the older, wealthier, more conservative segments of the Jewish community, public criticism of Israel increased among younger, more progressive individuals, members of minorities, liberal Protestant denominations, and some Reform, conservative, and unaffiliated Jews. By 2016, the numbers indicating a shift in this direction and a parallel hardening of opinion in support of Israel among other groups were striking. A poll released by the Brookings Institution in December 2016 showed that 60% of Democrats and 46% of all Americans supported sanctions against Israel over its construction of illegal Jewish settlements in the West Bank. Most Democrats, 55%, believed Israel has too much influence on U.S. politics and policies and is a strategic burden. Shibli Telhami, American Attitudes on the Israeli-Palestinian Conflict, Brookings, December 2nd, 2016. A Pew Research Center poll taken that same year showed that the proportion of people born after 1980 and of Democrats who are sympathetic to the Palestinians is growing in relation to those who sympathize with Israel. Quote, Views of Israel and Palestinians, unquote. Pew Research Center, May 5th, 2016. A Pew poll released in January 2018 revealed an acceleration of this trend. Democrats were almost as inclined to support the Palestinians as Israel, while twice as many liberal Democrats sympathized with more of the Palestinians than with Israelis. Quote, Republicans and Democrats grow even further apart in views of Israel, Palestinians, unquote. Pew Research Center, January 23rd, 2018. In April 2019, Pew poll showed that the deep partisan divide over Israel and Palestine was further accentuated. While asked whether they favored the Palestinian people over the Israeli people, or vice versa, or favored both, 58% of Democrats favored both peoples or the Palestinians, while 76% of Republicans favored both peoples or the Israelis. Meanwhile, 61% of Republicans had a favorable view of the Israeli government, but only 26% of Democrats did. Carol Doherty, quote, A new perspective on Americans' views of Israelis and Palestinians, unquote. Pew Research Center, April 24, 2019. Taken together, these figures were unprecedented. Thus, the wars on Gaza joined in 1982 war in Lebanon and the First Intifada as crucial turning points in an ongoing shift in how Palestinians in Israel are perceived by Americans. There has been no smooth upward line, but rather an ebb and flow, given the impact of suicide bombings during the Second Intifada, and especially the undiminished effectiveness of Israel's ceaseless proselytizing. But the unmistakable wave of critical sentiment has in every case increased after a sequence of horrific images, and the reality they represent has broken through the dense screen of defense carefully erected to shield Israel's behavior and to hide that reality. Despite the slow but steady shift in American public opinion regarding Palestine and Israel in recent years, there was a little apparent change in the making of U.S. policy, in new legislation, and in the political discourse in general. One reason for this was the Republican Party's control of the White House for all but 8 years since 2000, of the Senate since 2010, of the House from 2014 until 2018, and of all branches of government between 2016 and 2018. The party's base, especially the evangelicals, its core in many regions, older, whiter, and more likely to be conservative and male, fervently supported the most hawkish Israeli policies. Most Republican elected officials faithfully reflected the fervor of that base, as well as that of conservative donors to the party, many of whom, like Sheldon Adelson and Paul Singer, who were between them donated $100 million to Republicans during the 2016 election cycle, have been vigorously committed to an even more hawkish approach toward Israel. Additionally, the Islamophobia, xenophobia, and aggressive view of America's role in the world of much of the Republican base and party leadership matched the ethos of Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and his right-wing government. Indeed, this was on ample display in the rapturous reception Netanyahu received when he spoke before two different joint sessions of a Republican-dominated Congress in 2011 and 2015. Only Winston Churchill, who addressed Congress in 1941, 1943, and 1952, had the honor of giving more than one such speech. The Democratic Party's case, with regard to Israel and Palestine, has been more complicated and contradictory. The shift in much of the party's base took place most notably among its younger minority and more liberal segments, representing the party's future. It was not reflected in the views of the party leadership or most of its elected officials and big donors, representing its past. The dynamic at work was both generational, race and class-based, and also influenced by the party's big donors and powerful pressure groups such as AIPAC. The polls show that views on Palestine and Israel often correlate closely with age. Older people tend to be more conservative and conventional. In 2019, the leaders of the Democratic Party comprised Nancy Pelosi, 78, Charles Schumer, 68, and a party machine dominated by the Clintons, both in their early 70s. All of them are rich, Pelosi exceedingly so. She is one of the wealthiest members of Congress, with a net worth, together with her husband, reportedly over $100 million. With the incessant fundraising that is a central concern of American politicians and the rightward turn of the Democrats in the late 1980s, the party became more favorable and attractive to moneyed interests. As a result, the views of donors have been more important to the party's leaders and elected officials than those of the party's base or of its voters. And many of the biggest donors to the party, such as a media mogul Haim Sabin and others from the high-tech, entertainment, and financial industries, remained unfailingly committed to Israel, irrespective of its excesses. Democrats were thus torn between the inclinations of their older leaders and many big donors to support an act of the Israeli government and the party's rank and file, which began pushing hard for a change. This was evident in the unconventional positions on Israel and Palestine taken by presidential candidate Bernie Sanders during the 2016 Democratic primary campaign, and in floor fights over the party platform at the convention that year. The split was on display as well in the party leadership struggle that followed the 2016 elections, with the frontrunner Representative Keith Ellison subjected to smears and innuendo, in part because of his outspoken position on Palestine. That the efforts to change the Democratic Party's line on Palestine had little concrete impact was seen in the bipartisan support for the annual military assistance given to Israel over $4 billion, and for a tide of legislation that disadvantaged the Palestinians. However, a small shift in Congress could be discerned in a bill co-sponsored by 30 members of the House in November 2017 and reintroduced in April 2019 as H.R. 2407 that sought to ensure that U.S. aid would not support Israeli security forces' mistreatment and imprisonment of Palestinian children, 10,000 of whom had been detained by the occupation since 2000. Excuse me. The chief sponsor of the bill was Congresswoman Betty McCollum, DFL-MN, I'm assuming Minnesota. Although these political realities can explain much, especially where legislation and political rhetoric is concerned, they shed limited light on the making of policy. In crafting U.S. foreign policy, the effective branch traditionally has great latitude. The executive branch traditionally has great latitude. It is not necessarily as constrained as Congress. Haunted as its members are by the election cycle and the fundraising this necessitates. American presidents indeed have repeatedly acted freely with little regard for the objections of Israel and its supporters when they considered vital, core U.S. interests to be at stake. A false narrative would have it that the influence of Israel and its supporters on Middle East policy is always paramount. But this is true only when policymakers do not consider vital U.S. strategic interests to be engaged, and when in domestic political considerations are especially weighty, for example, in a presidential election year. Examples of the United States overriding strong Israeli resistance to serve Washington's perceived interests are legion. During the 1956 Suez War, the U.S. opposed aggression against Egypt as contrary to its Cold War interests. At the end of 1968 through 1970, war of attrition, alongside the Suez Canal, the United States imposed a ceasefire to Israel's strategic disadvantage to avert a U.S.-Soviet confrontation. In between 1973 and 1975, Kissinger imposed 3 disengagement agreements necessitating Israeli military withdrawals over furious Israeli objections. It is the case that most of these actions ultimately served Israel's long-range interests as well, the short-sighted objections of its leaders notwithstanding. Other examples range from the lucrative sales of advanced weapons to Saudi Arabia, despite vociferous opposition by Israel and its lobby in Washington, to the Iran nuclear deal negotiated by President Barack Obama in the teeth of hostility from Netanyahu and his supporters in Congress. The point is that when vital U.S. interests are seen to be at stake in Washington, American presidents have without hesitation acted in service of these interests, paying only limited attention to Israel's concerns. However, when it comes to Palestine and peacemaking between Palestinians and Israelis that necessarily entails concessions from the latter, there seem to be no major U.S. strategic or economic interests at stake, and no means to counterbalance the sustained opposition from Israel and its supporters, which is inevitably greater on this one issue than others. 42. These are the situations accurately described by John Mearsheimer and Stephen Walt in The Israel Lobby and U.S. Foreign Policy, New York, Farrar, Straus, and Garreau, 2007. U.S. presidents, from Truman to Donald Trump, have been reluctant to walk into this buzzsaw of antagonism and have thus, by and large, allowed Israel to dictate the pace of events and to even determine U.S. positions on issues relating to Palestine and the Palestinians. It could be argued that this permissive American attitude toward Israel's behavior, occasionally masked by a declaratory opposition to specific measures, which rarely change the situation on the ground, endangers U.S. interests in the Middle East, given the widespread support for the Palestinians by the populations of the Arab world. This emerges clearly from the previously cited poll of over 18,000 respondents in 11 Arab countries in 2017 and 2018 by the Arab Center for Research and Policy Studies. But the Middle East has for years been ruled by the largest concentration of autocratic regimes of any region in the world. Moreover, the United States has never supported the advance of democracy in the Middle East in any sustained way, preferring to deal with the dictatorships and absolute monarchies that control most countries. These undemocratic regimes have historically been subservient to the United States and valuable clients of its defense, aerospace, oil, banking, and real estate industries. They have generally acted in defiance of their own pro-Palestinian public opinion, thus immunizing Washington from any blowback for its support of Israel's occupation and colonization of Palestine. The key country in this regard has been Saudi Arabia, which since 1948 has publicly advocated for the Palestinian cause, often giving the PLO financial support, while doing little or nothing to pressure the United States to change its favorable policies towards Israel. The passivity of the Saudi monarchy goes back at least to August 1948, when Secretary of State George Marshall thanked King Abd al-Aziz ibn Saud for the kingdom's, quote, conciliatory manner, unquote, over Palestine. This was at the height of the 1948 war, after Israeli troops had overrun most of the country and expelled much of the Palestinian population. Secretary of State to Legation, Jeddah, August 17, 1948. FRUS, 1948, Volume 2, Part 2, 1318. For further details on how the Saudi regime catered to Washington over Palestine, see R. Khalidi, Brokers of Deceit, 24 through 27. Saudi Arabia has grown far more influential in the region since the defeat of Egypt in 1967 and post-1973. Flood of oil money into the kingdom's coffers, but otherwise little has changed in its acquiescent attitude toward Israel in the intervening decades. This dynamic was visible during the George Bush administration, when both the remaining Arabists and the, quote, peace processors, unquote, were largely sidelined from Middle East policymaking. Bush, Cheney, and Rumsfeld instead relied on a cadre of fervently pro-Israel neoconservative hawks like Paul Wolfowitz, Richard Perle, Douglas Feith, and Louis Scooter Libby. Many of them retreads from the Reagan administration. They systematically excluded those knowledgeable about the region from any involvement in key decisions, whether regarding Palestine, the disastrous war they launched on Iraq, or the war on terror, which was waged almost entirely in the Middle East and other parts of the Muslim world. In Washington, the Sharon government shrewdly managed to sell its campaign against the violent Second Palestinian Intifada as an integral part of the latter war, and itself as a vital ally, while self-servingly provided much of the flimsy intellectual justification for this ideological crusade. In return, in 2004, Bush accepted the inclusion of the settlement blocks, quote, already existing major Israeli population centers, unquote, within Israel's frontiers in the context of a final peace settlement. This was contained in a letter from Bush to Sharon, delivered on April 14, 2004, during a meeting in Washington. Bush also endorsed Sharon's sudden decision to carry out a unilateral Israeli withdrawal of troops and settlers from the Gaza Strip in 2005. Israel did this without coordination with the Palestinians, while maintaining Israel's control over entry to and exit from the Strip, which remained under siege and was soon taken over by Hamas. This set the stage for the next round of Gaza wars. The president who occupied the White House during all three of Israel's assaults on Gaza, Barack Obama, continued the pattern of his predecessors. His election had raised the hopes of many trusting souls who believed that a U.S. president with Hussein as his middle name, who had been photographed with Edward Said, who was my neighbor and colleague at the University of Chicago, who declared a new beginning for the United States and the Muslim world, surely he would deal differently with Palestine. These hopes sprung from the assumption that presidents have unlimited freedom to act. But despite the considerable leeway afforded the executive branch, there remains the tenacious power of the permanent bureaucracy, of the, homogeneous coterie of experts circulating in and out of government, of Congress, and of other structural and political factors. There is also the potency of conventional thinking on Israel and Palestine, entrenched in the leaderships of both political parties and in the mainstream media, as well as the formidable power of the Israel lobby and the fact there is no effective countervailing force in U.S. politics. Any semblance of an Arab lobby has never been more than a collection of high-priced PR shops, law firms, consultants, and lobbyists paid handsomely to protect the interests of the corrupt, kleptocratic elites that misrule most of the Arab countries. Most of these dictatorial rulers are beholden to the U.S. and are valuable clients of American defense, aerospace, oil, banking, and real estate interests, which have vast influence in Washington. These potent forces also lobby for Arab kleptocrats, but not for, quote, the Arabs, unquote, if by that is meant the peoples of these countries. Still, another hopeful sign was Obama's quick appointment of George Mitchell as Special Envoy for Middle East Peace in January 2009. Charged with kickstarting direct Israeli-Palestinian negotiations for a final settlement. Mitchell was a negotiator in the mold of Cyrus Vance and James Baker, an independent-minded and experienced Washington hand who, at the late stage of his career, was not beholden to Israel or its lobby. He had served as governor of Maine and as Senate Majority Leader. As Special Envoy for President Bill Clinton, he had successfully negotiated the Northern Ireland Good Friday Agreement in 1998, bringing the IRA in from the cold and involving them in a settlement. Unlike the peace processors of the Clinton era, Mitchell did not accept Israel's positions as the limits of U.S. policy and strove to confront head-on the most thorny aspects of negotiations: freezing Jewish settlements, the future of Jerusalem, and the return of Palestinian refugees. Building on his success with the IRA in Ireland, he proposed involving Hamas in the negotiating process, which he saw as crucial to the comprehensive solution. But he was ultimately unsuccessful, in large measure because of Israeli opposition. But Mitchell suffered from a particular disadvantage. He was undermined from within the Obama administration. The key figure in the sabotage of Mitchell's mission was none other than the ineffable Dennis Ross. Ross was out of government during the George W. Bush years, but he had campaigned in Florida and elsewhere for Obama in 2008, defending him against Republican accusations for insufficient support for Israel. The newly elected president was therefore beholden to him. As a sop to those unhappy with Mitchell's appointment, besides his willingness to deal with Hamas, Mitchell was partly of Lebanese ancestry, the first senior U.S. official involved in the Middle East with that background since Philip Habib. Ross was brought in as special advisor to Secretary of State Hillary Clinton. He was supposed to focus on the Gulf, but quickly began to involve himself in the Palestinian-Israeli negotiations, where the Israelis saw him as a preferred interlocutor. When Ross's interference with Mitchell's efforts became intolerable, as he repeatedly went behind the special envoy's back, setting up secret back channels with the Israelis, he left his post at Foggy Bottom, but he landed on his feet with a new position at the National Security Council, where he was even closer to the president. He continued to interfere with Mitchell's work, making side deals with the Netanyahu government, while the PA refused any contact with him because of his overt bias toward Israel. It was an unequal fight. Mitchell versus the Israel lobby, Congress, and Netanyahu, with Ross all the while drawing on support from his patrons to operate behind the ex-senator's back. Instead of Israel facing a single U.S. government representative determined to extract concessions from both sides, it was able to play the pliable and always acquiescent Ross against Mitchell. In this situation, Israel could simply stand pat, and no progress towards settlement was possible. In the end, the coup de grace was administered by Mitchell by his former colleagues in Congress, who decreed that involving Hamas in the negotiating process was unacceptable and violated U.S. law. Interviews with two senior officials directly involved with these matters who preferred to remain anonymous. February 1, 2010, and January 11, 2011. Israel had won. The status quo was preserved. The Palestinians remained divided, and Israel was not obliged to talk to Hamas or even seriously negotiate, all without having had to take much of an effort. Ross and Congress had done Israel's work for it. Although Obama had indicated that the Palestinian issue was a priority for his administration, his response to the wars on Gaza was a truer measure of his engagement. The first of them that took place on his watch began after his election, but before he was inaugurated. At no point then or subsequently did the president seek to disturb the false narrative whereby what was underway in the Gaza Strip during these ferocious onslaughts was a righteous response to terrorist rocket fire aimed at Israeli civilians. At no point did his administration interrupt the flow of American weapons that were used to kill some 3,000 Palestinian civilians and maim many more. Indeed, deliveries were accelerated when Israel deemed that necessary. At no point did Obama decisively confront Israel over its siege of the Gaza Strip. For his early intimations of a change in Washington's bias in favor of Israel, Obama was heartily loathed by its right-wing leaders and their American supporters. He fully reciprocated that sentiment. But in the end, he changed nothing in Palestine. In spite of fruitless efforts to resolve the conflict by Obama's Secretary of State, John Kerry, the sole mark administration left was Security Council Resolution 2334, passed 14-1, with a U.S. abstention, that called Israeli settlement activity in the West Bank and East Jerusalem a, quote, flagrant violation, unquote, of international law with, quote, no legal validity, unquote. Adopted in December 2016, when Obama was already a lame duck, the resolution provided for no sanctions and no coercive measures against Israel. Like other American declaratory posturing, the resolution was toothless and had absolutely no effect on the situation on the ground. Obama was particularly unlucky in that just months after his inauguration, Netanyahu, with whom his relations went from frigid to awful, took office for the second time and continued to develop his close ties with the Republican opposition to the president. For these and many other reasons, Obama left the White House in 2017 with the colonial status quo in Palestine of military occupation and expanding Jewish settlement intact, and the conditions for Palestinians even worse than when he took office 8 years earlier. The lesson is clear. Had Obama genuinely considered the issues of peace between Palestinians and Israelis to be a priority, as important as the nuclear agreement with Iran, he could have worked to push it through against congressional opposition and the efforts of AIPAC and the Israeli government, and perhaps he might have succeeded. On behalf of a matter of supreme significance, that war on peace with Iran, Obama was able to stand up to and overcome the Israel lobby and its Israeli patrons. However, it was apparent the view of the president that breaking the stalemate in Palestine did not constitute enough of a vital strategic American interest for him to engage his prestige and power and political capital. The Mitchell Initiative thus died quietly in 2011, and the efforts of Kerry in 2016, and with them the prospect of conducting negotiations between Israel and the Palestinians on an entirely new basis. As the centenary of the war on Palestine came and went, the American metropole, the irreplaceable base for Israel's freedom of action, was as committed to the Zionist colonial project as had been Lord Balfour 100 years earlier. The second century of the war would be marked by a new and even more destructive approach to the issue of Palestine, with the United States in close coordination with Israel and its newfound friends in the absolute monarchies of the Gulf. Conclusion: a century of war on the Palestinians. In 1917, Arthur James Balfour stated that in Palestine, the British government did not, quote, propose even to go through the form of consulting the wishes of the present inhabitants of the country, unquote. The great powers were committed to Zionism, he continued, quote, and Zionism, be it right or wrong, good or bad, is rooted in age-long traditions, in present needs, in future hopes, of far profounder import than the desires and prejudices of the 700,000 Arabs who now inhabit that ancient land. Unquote. Quote, memorandum by Mr. Balfour, Paris, respecting Syria, Palestine, and Mesopotamia, unquote, August 11, 1919, and documents on British foreign policy, 1919 through 1930. Edition E.L. Woodward and Rohan Butler, London, H.M. Stationery Office, 1952. "100 years later, President Donald Trump recognized Jerusalem as Israel's capital, saying, quote, we took Jerusalem off the table, so we don't have to talk about it anymore, unquote. Trump told Benjamin Netanyahu, quote, you won 1 point, and you'll give up some points later on in the negotiation, if it ever takes place. I don't know that it will ever take place, unquote. Quote, remarks by President Trump and Prime Minister Netanyahu of Israel before bilateral meeting Davos, Switzerland, unquote, January 25th, 2018. The center of the Palestinians' history, identity, culture, and worship was thus summarily disposed of without even the pretense of consulting their wishes. Throughout the intervening century, the great powers have repeatedly tried to act in spite of the Palestinians, ignoring them, talking for them, or over their heads, or pretending that they did not exist. In the face of the heavy odds against them, however, the Palestinians have shown a stubborn capacity to resist these efforts to eliminate them politically and scatter them to the four winds. Indeed, more than 120 years after the first Zionist Congress in Basel, and over 70 years after the creation of Israel, the Palestinian people, represented on neither of these occasions, were no longer supposed to constitute any kind of national presence. In their place was meant to stand a Jewish state, uncontested by the indigenous society that it was meant to supplant. Yet for all its might, its nuclear weapons, and its alliance with the United States, today the Jewish state is at least as contested globally as it was any time in the past. The Palestinians' resistance, their persistence, and their challenge to Israel's ambitions are among the most striking phenomena of the current era. Over the decades, the United States has wavered, going back and forth between paying lip service to the existence of the Palestinians and trying to exclude them from the map of the Middle East. The provision for an Arab state in the 1948 partition resolution, albeit never implemented, Jimmy Carter's mention of the Palestinian, quote, homeland, unquote, and nominal support for a Palestinian state from the Clinton to the Obama administrations were artifacts of that lip service. There are many more instances of American exclusion and erasure. Lyndon Johnson's backing of UNSC 242, Kissinger's years of sidelining the PLO in the 1960s and 1970s, and covertly making proxy war on it, the 1978 Camp David Accords, the Reagan administration's green light for the 1982 war in Lebanon, the lack of will of U.S. presidents from Johnson to Obama to stop Israeli seizure and settlement of Palestinian land. Regardless of its wavering, the United States, the great imperial power of that age, together with Great Britain before it, extended full backing to the Zionist movement and the state of Israel. But they have been trying to do the impossible: impose a colonial reality on Palestine in a post-colonial age. Iqbal Ahmed summed it up, quote, August 1947 marked the beginning of decolonization, when British rule in India ended. It was in those days of hope and fulfillment that the decolonization of Palestine occurred. Thus, at the dawn of decolonization, we were returned to the earliest, most intense form of colonial menace, exclusivist settler colonialism. See Bengelsdorf et al. Eds. The Selected Writings of Iqbal Ahmed, 301. In other circumstances or in another era, replacing the indigenous population might have been feasible, especially in light of the long-standing and deep religious link felt by Jews to the land in question. If this were the 18th or 19th century, the Palestinians were as few as the Zionist settlers, or as fully decimated as the native peoples of Australia, Asia, and North America. The longevity of the Palestinians' resistance to their disposition, however, indicates that the Zionist movement, in the words of the late historian Tony Jute, quote, arrived too late, unquote, as it, quote, imported a characteristically late 19th century separatist project into a world that has moved on, unquote. Jute's article, quote, Israel, the Alternative, unquote, the New York Review of Books, October 23rd, 2003. Controversial at the time, would probably cause fewer waves today. Although in the current atmosphere, his critique of Zionism might draw absurd accusations of anti-Semitism. With the establishment of Israel, Zionism did succeed in fashioning a potent national movement and a thriving new people in Palestine. But it could not fully supplant the country's original population. Which is what would have been necessary for the ultimate triumph of Zionism. Settler colonial confrontations with indigenous people have only ended in one of three ways: with the elimination or full subjugation of the native population, as in North America, with the defeat and expulsion of the colonizer, as in Algeria, which is extremely rare, or with the abandonment of colonial supremacy, in the context of compromise and reconciliation, as in South Africa, Zimbabwe, and Ireland. There is still the possibility that Israel could attempt to reprise the expulsions of 1948 and 1967, and rid itself of some or all of Palestinians who tenaciously remain in their homeland. Forcible transfers of population on a sectarian and ethnic basis have taken place in neighboring Iraq since its invasion by the United States, and in Syria following its collapse into war and chaos. The UN High Commissioner for Refugees reported in 2017 that a record 68 million persons and refugees were displaced the world over. Against this horrific regional and global background, which elicits scarce concern internationally, there might seem to be little to restrain Israel from such an action. But the ferocious fight that Palestinians would wage against their removal, the intense international attention to the conflict, and the growing currency of the Palestinian narrative all mitigate against such a prospect. Given the clarity of what is involved in ethnic cleansing in a colonial situation, rather than circumstances of a confusing civil proxy war, interlaced with extensive foreign intervention, as in Syria and Iraq, a new wave of expulsions would probably not unfold as smoothly for Israel as in the past. Even if undertaken under cover of a major regional war, such a move would have the potential to cause fatal damage to the West's support for Israel, on which it relies. Nonetheless, there are growing fears that expulsion has become more possible in the past few years than at any time since 1948. With religious nationalists and settlers dominating successive Israeli governments, explicit plans for annexations in the West Bank, and leading Israeli parliamentarians calling for the removal of some or all of the Palestinian population. Punitive Israeli policies are currently directed at forcing as many Palestinians as possible out of the country, while also evicting some within the West Bank and the Negev inside Israel from their homes and villages via home demolition, fake property sales, rezoning, and myriad other schemes. It is only a step from these tried and true demographic engineering tactics to a repeat of the full-blown ethnic cleansing of 1948 and 1967. Still, the odds so far seem against Israeli taking such a step. If elimination of the native population is not a likely outcome in Palestine, then what about dismantling the supremacy of the colonizer in order to make a possible... I gotta reread that. If elimination of the native population is not a likely outcome in Palestine, then what of dismantling the supremacy of the colonizer in order to make possible a true reconciliation? The advantage that Israel has enjoyed in continuing its project rests on the fact that the basically colonial nature of the encounter in Palestine has not been visible to most Americans and many Europeans. Israel appears to them to be a normal, natural nation-state like any other, faced by the irrational hostility of intransigent and often anti-Semitic Muslims, which is how Palestinians, even the Christians among them, are seen by many. The propagation of this image is one of the greatest achievements of Zionism and is vital to its survival. As Edward Said put it, Zionism triumphed in part because it, quote, won the political battle for Palestine in the international world, in which ideas, representation, rhetoric, and images were at issue, unquote. Quote, introduction, unquote. Blaming the victims, spurious scholarship in the Palestinian question. Edition, Edward Said and Christopher Hitchens, New York, Verso, 1988. 1. This is still largely true today. Dismantling this fallacy and making the true nature of the conflict evident is a necessary step if Palestinians and Israelis are to transition to a post-colonial future in which one people does not use external support to oppress and supplant the other. Recent polls have revealed the shifts that have begun to take place among some segments of American public opinion. While encouraging to advocates of Palestinian freedom, they do not reflect the stance of most Americans, nor are they necessarily based on a sound understanding of the colonial dynamic at work in the conflict. Moreover, public opinion can shift again. Events on the ground in Palestine have recently tilted the scales of sympathy slightly in favor of the Palestinians, but other events could cause them to tilt in the opposite direction, as happened during the Second Intifada. Amply funded efforts have been launched to achieve just such a reversal, and particularly by smearing critics of Israel as, quote, anti-Semites. These international efforts, closely coordinated by the Israeli Ministry of Strategic Affairs, focus in particular on labeling the boycott, divestment, and sanctions, BDS, okay, eating up for that, movement as, quote, anti-Semitic, unquote. The Journal of Palestine Studies has published a series of articles on these efforts. Hever, quote, BDS suppression attempts in Germany backfire, unquote, 48, number 3, spring 2019, pages 86 through 96. Barry Trachtenberg and Kyle Stanton, quote, Shifting Sands, Zionism and U.S. Jewry, unquote, page 48. Number 2, Winter 2019, pages 79 through 87. Dominique Vidal, quote, Conflating Anti-Zionism with Anti-Semitism, France in the Crosshairs, quote, or unquote, pages 48. Number 1, Autumn 2018, 119 through 30. Maybe that's referring to paragraph 48. What is it? Oh, 48, 48, 48. Moshe Mashover, quote, An Immoral Dilemma, The Trap of Zionist Propaganda, unquote, 47. Number 4, Summer 2018, 69 through 78. While counter efforts to strengthen this positive trend are puny by comparison, the experience of the past few decades shows that 3 approaches have been effective in expanding the way in which the reality in Palestinians is understood. The first rests on the fertile comparison of the case of Palestine to other colonial settler experiences, whether that of the Native Americans, or South Africans, or the Irish. The second, related to the first, involves focusing on the gross imbalance of power between Israel and the Palestinians, a characteristic of all colonial encounters. The third, and perhaps most important, is to foreground the issue of inequality. Establishing the colonial nature of the conflict has proven exceedingly hard given the biblical dimensions of Zionism, which casts the new arrivals as indigenous and as historic proprietors of the land they colonized. In this light, the original population of Palestine appears extraneous to the post-Holocaust resurgence of a Jewish nation-state, with its roots in the kingdom of David and Solomon. They are no more than undesirable interlopers in this uplifting scenario. Challenging this epic myth is especially difficult in the United States, which is steeped in an evangelical Protestantism that makes it particularly susceptible to such an evocative Bible-based appeal, and which also prides itself on a colonial past. The word colonial has a valence in the United States that is deeply different from its associations in the former European imperial metropolies in the countries that were once part of their empires. Similarly, the terms settler and pioneer have positive connotations in American history, arising from the heroic tale of the conquest of the West at the expense of its indigenous population as projected in movies, literature, and television. Indeed, there are striking parallels between these portrayals of the resistance of Native Americans to their disposition and that of the Palestinians. Both groups are cast as backward and uncivilized, a violent, murderous, and irrational obstacle to progress and modernity. While many Americans have begun to contest this strand of their national narrative, Israeli society and its supporters still celebrate, indeed, depend on, its foundational version. Moreover, comparisons between Palestine and the Native American or African American experiences are fraught because the United States has yet to fully acknowledge these dark chapters of its past or to address their toxic effects in the present. There is still a long way to go to change Americans' consciousness of their nation's history, let alone that of Palestine and Israel, in which the United States has played such a supportive role. The second track for changing existing perceptions of the conflict, highlighting the great imbalance between the Palestinians and the powers arrayed against them, involves showing that the Zionist movement was always almost on the offensive in its effort to achieve mastery over an Arab land. Presenting this reality otherwise has been central to the discursive advantage achieved by Zionism, in which Israel is David to the Arab Muslim Goliath. A more recent fiction casts the conflict as one of two peoples, or even two states, in an equal fight, sometimes framed as right versus right. Even then, the accepted version is that Israel has constantly wished for peace, only to be rebuffed by the Palestinians. Quote, "There is no partner for peace," unquote, as the phrase goes, leaving Israelis, the victims, to defend themselves against unjustifiable terrorism and rocket fire. In reality, the Zionist movement and then the State of Israel has always had the big battalions on their side. Whether this was the British Army before 1939, US and Soviet support in 1947 through 1948, France and Britain in the 1950s and 1960s, or the situation from the 1970s until today, where besides receiving unlimited US support, Israel's armed might dwarfs that of the Palestinians, and indeed that of the Arabs put together. It is the issue of inequality that is most promising for expanding the understanding of the reality in Palestine. It is also the most important, since inequality was essential to the creation of a Jewish state in an overwhelmingly Arab land, and is vital to maintaining the state's dominance. Inequality is so crucial not only because it is anathema to an egalitarian, democratic societies that the Zionist project has primarily relied on for its support, but because equality of rights is key to a just, lasting resolution of the entire problem. Within Israel, certain important rights are reserved exclusively for Jewish citizens and denied to the 20% of citizens who are Palestinian. Of course, the 5 million Palestinians living under an Israeli military regime in the occupied territories have no rights at all, while the 500,000 plus Israeli colonists there enjoy full rights. This systematic ethnic discrimination was always a central facet of Zionism, which by definition aimed to create a Jewish society and polity with exclusive national rights in a land with an Arab majority. Even as Israel's 1948 Declaration of Independence proclaimed, quote, "complete equality of social and political rights to all its inhabitants irrespective of religion, race, or sex," unquote. Quote, "the Declaration of the Establishment of the State of Israel," unquote, May 14th, 1948. Dozens of crucial laws based on inequality of rights were implemented in the ensuing years. These severely restricted or totally banned Arab access to land and to residency in all Jewish communities, formalized the seizure of the property and collective waqf property on non-Jews, prevented most indigenous Palestinians who were made into refugees from returning to their homes, while giving citizenship rights to Jewish immigrants and limited access to many others' benefits. This core problem is even more stark today, with a total Arab population in Palestine and Israel from the Jordan River to the sea that is equal to or perhaps slightly larger than the Jewish population. That inequality is the central moral question posed by Zionism, and that it goes to the root of the legitimacy of the entire enterprise is a view that is shared by some distinguished Israelis. Imagining scholars looking back 100 years from now, historian Zev Sternhall asked, quote, "When exactly did the Israelis understand that their cruelty towards the non-Jews in their grip in the occupied territories, their determination to break the Palestinians' hope for independence, or the refusal to offer asylum to African refugees began to undermine their moral legitimacy of their national existence?" Zev Sternhall, quote, "En Israël poussait un racisme proche du nazisme au ses débuts," unquote. Le Monde, February 20th, 2018, 22, my translation. For decades, Zionists insisted, often referring to the state's Declaration of Independence, that Israel could be and was both, quote, Jewish and democratic, unquote. As the contradictions inherent in this formulation grew ever more apparent, some Israeli leaders admitted, indeed even declared it with pride, that if they were forced to choose, the Jewish aspect would take precedence. In July 2018, the Knesset codified that choice in constitutional law, adopting the, quote, basic law on the Jewish nation state, unquote, which institutionalized statutory inequality among Israeli citizens by arrogating the right of national self-determination exclusively to the Jewish people, downgrading the status of Arabic and declaring Jewish settlement a national value with precedence over other needs. For a lucid analysis of the law, see Hassan Jabarin and Suhad Bishara, quote, The Jewish Nation State Law, Antecedents and Constitutional Implications, unquote. Journal of Palestine Studies, 48, number 2, winter 2019, pages 46 through 55. For its text, see pages 44 through 45. And for a petition to the Israeli Supreme Court on the subject of the law by Adalah, the Legal Center for Arab Minority Rights in Israel, see 56 through 57. Former Justice Minister Ayet Shakid, one of the more forthright advocates of Jewish supremacy and a sponsor of the law, had made the case bluntly a few months before legislation came to vote. Quote, There are places where the character of the state of Israel as a Jewish state must be maintained, and this sometimes comes at the expense of equality, unquote. Revital Hovel, quote, Justice Minister, Israel must keep Jewish majority even at the expense of human rights, unquote. Haaretz, February 13th, 2018. She added, quote, Israel isn't a state of all its nations. That is, equal rights to all citizens, but not equal national rights, unquote. Where this ideology leads was summarized in the equally blunt words of the Likud Knesset member, Miki Zohar. The Palestinian, he said, quote, does not have the right of self-determination because he is not the proprietor of the land. I want him as a resident because of my honesty. As he was born here, he lives here, and I would never tell him to leave. I regret to say it, but they suffer from one major defect. They were not born Jews, unquote. Ibid, see also Ravit Hecht, quote, the lawmaker who thinks Israel is deceiving the Palestinians. No one is going to give them a state, unquote. Haaretz Weekend, October 28, 2017. This connection between an exclusive right to land and peoplehood is central to a specific type of, quote, blood and soil, unquote, Central European nationalism, which is the ground from which Zionism sprang. Commenting on an early draft of the Jewish nation state law, Sternhell, whose area of expertise in European fascism, noted that the constitutional ideas behind this legislation are consonant with those of Charles Maurras, the French anti-Semite and neo-fascist of the 1930s, or of modern-day Polish and Hungarian nationalists and the, quote, hardest line European chauvinists, unquote. However, he added, they are entirely at odds with the liberal ideas of the French and American revolutions. Sternhell, quote, on oserait pousser un racisme proche du nazisme à ses débuts, unquote. By embracing its illiberal and discriminatory essence, modern Zionism is increasingly in contradiction with the ideals, particularly that of equality, on which Western democracies are based. For the United States, Canada, Great Britain, France, and Germany, which cherish these values, even if they are often honored only in the breach and are currently threatened by potent illiberal, populist, and authoritarian right-wing trends. This should be a serious matter, especially given that Israel is still dependent on the support of these Western countries. Finally, uprooting the systematic inequality inherent in Zionism is crucial to creating a better future for both peoples, Palestinians and Israelis. Any formula advanced as a resolution of the conflict will necessarily, inevitably fail if it is not squarely based on the principle of equality. Absolute equality of human, personal, civil, political, and national rights must be enshrined in whatever future scheme is ultimately accepted by the two societies. This is a high-sounding recommendation, but nothing else will address the core of the problem, nor will it be sustainable and lasting. This leaves the thorny issue of how to wean Israelis from their attachment to inequality, which is often coded as and justified by a need for security. This perceived need is to a large extent rooted in a real history of insecurity and persecution, but in response to this past trauma, generations have now been brought up on how a reflexive dogma of aggressive nationalism, whose tenacious hold will be hard to break. Thus, the Jewish citizens of a regional superpower that cows its neighbors and has bombed the capitals of 7 of them with impunity. Israeli planes have different times bombed Tunis, Cairo, Khartoum, Amman, Beirut, Damascus, and Baghdad, several of them repeatedly, and several of them recently. Suffer from a deep insecurity rooted in part in this history, and perhaps in part from an unspoken concern that the carefully constructed and justified colonial reality they live in might suddenly unravel. The syndrome that drives this imperative to dominate and discriminate can probably only be addressed by those within Israeli society, or close to it, who understand the grim direction of the country's current course, or who can challenge the distortions of history, ethics, and Judaism that this ideology constitutes. Doing so is surely the primary and the most urgent task of Israelis and their supporters who wish to change the dynamic of injustice and inequality. Palestinians, too, need weaning from a pernicious delusion rooted in the colonial nature of their encounter with Zionism and its denial of Palestinian peoplehood. The Jewish Israelis are not a, quote, real people, real, unquote, people, and that they do not have national rights. While it is true that Zionism has transmuted the Jewish religion and the historic peoplehood of the Jews into something quite different, a modern nationalism, this does not erase the fact that Israeli Jews today consider themselves a people with a sense of national belonging in Palestine, what they think of as the land of Israel. No matter how this transmutation came about, Palestinians, too, today consider themselves a people with national links to what is indeed their ancestral homeland, for reasons that are as arbitrary and as conjunctional as those that led to Zionism as arbitrary and as the reasons that led to the emergence of scores of modern national movements. Such a conclusion about the constructed nature of all national entities, enraging to apostles of nationalism, is self-evident to those who have studied its genesis in a myriad of different circumstances. This essential argument of my book, Palestinian Identity, in line with these put forth by several of the most respected writers on nationalism, including Benedict Anderson, Eric Hobsbawm, and Ernest Gellner. The irony is that, like all peoples, Palestinians assume that their nationalism is pure and historically rooted, while denying the same of Israeli Jews. There is, of course, a difference between the two. Most Palestinians are descended from people who have lived in what they naturally see as their country for a long time, for many centuries, if not many millennia. Most Israeli Jews came from Europe and the Arab countries relatively recently as part of the colonial process sanctioned and brokered by the great powers. The former are indigenous, the latter settlers, or descendants of settlers, although many have been there for generations now, and deeply felt an ancient religious connection to the country, albeit one quite different from the ancient rootedness in the country of the indigenous Palestinians. Because this is a colonial conflict, this difference matters enormously. However, no one today would deny that fully developed national entities exist in settler states like the United States, Canada, New Zealand, and Australia, despite their origins in colonial wars of extermination. Moreover, to those intoxicated by nationalism, such distinctions between settlers and indigenous peoples do not matter. As the anthropologist Ernest Gellner put it, quote, nations as a natural, God-given way of classifying men as an inherent political destiny are a myth. Nationalism, which sometimes takes pre-existing cultures and turns them into nations, sometimes invents them and often obliterates pre-existing cultures. That is a reality. Unquote. Ernest Gellner, Nations and Nationalism. Ithaca, New York, Cornell University Press, 1983, 48 through 49. Why the fundamentally colonial nature of the Palestinian-Israeli encounter must be acknowledged. There are now two people in Palestine. Irrespective of how they came into being, and the conflict between them cannot be resolved as long as the national existence of each is denied by the other. Their mutual acceptance can only be based on complete equality of rights, including national rights, notwithstanding the crucial historical differences between the two. There is no other possible sustainable solution, barring the unthinkable notion of one people's extermination or expulsion by the other. Overcoming the resistance of those who benefit from the status quo in order to ensure equal rights for all in this small country between the Jordan River and the sea. This is a test of political ingenuity of all concerned. Reducing the extensive sustained external support for the discriminatory and deeply unequal status quo would certainly smooth the path ahead. However, the war on Palestine passed the 100-year mark, with the Palestinians confronting circumstances more daunting than perhaps at any time since 1917. With his election, Donald Trump began pursuit of what he called, quote, the deal of the century, unquote, purportedly aimed at a conclusive resolution of the conflict. Closing the deal has so far involved dispensing with decades of bedrock U.S. policies, outsourcing strategic planning to Israel, and pouring contempt on the Palestinians. Inauspiciously, Trump's ambassador to Israel, David Friedman, his bankruptcy lawyer and longtime financial supporter of the Jewish settler movement, spoke of an, quote, alleged occupation, unquote, and demanded that the State Department stop using the term. In one interview, he declared that Israel has the, quote, right, quote, to annex, quote, some, but unlikely all, of the West Bank, unquote. Peter Beaumont, quote, Trump's ambassador to Israel refers to, quote, alleged occupation, unquote, of Palestinian territories, unquote. Guardian, September 1, 2017. Nathan Gutman, quote, U.S. Ambassador to Israel, asked State Department to stop using the word, quote, occupation, unquote. The forward. David Hallbringer, quote, U.S. Ambassador says Israel has right to annex parts of West Bank, unquote. New York Times, June 18, 2019. Jason Greenblatt, for over 2 years, envoy for Israel-Palestine negotiations, previously Trump's real estate lawyer and also a donor to Israeli Right to Peace, let me reread that again. Jason Greenblatt, for over 2 years, envoy for Israel-Palestine negotiations, previously Trump's real estate lawyer and also a donor to Israeli right-wing causes, stated that the West Bank settlements, quote, are not an obstacle to peace, unquote. Rejected use of the term, quote, occupation, unquote, in a meeting with EU envoys. Ruth Eglash, quote, top Trump advisor says settlements are not an obstacle to peace, unquote, Washington Post, November 10, 2017. Peter Smolar, quote, Washington ouvrira son ambassade à Jerusalem en mai, unquote, Le Monde, February 25th to 26th, 2018. And endorsed Friedman's views regarding annexation. The new administration quickly trumpeted an, quote, outside-in, quote, approach, in which 3 of the Sunni Arab Gulf monarchies, Saudi Arabia, the Emirates, and Bahrain, often falsely described as representing Sunni Arabs, were brought into a de facto alliance with Israel to stand together against Iran. The byproduct of this configuration was that these and other Arab regimes allied to the U.S. were encouraged to bully the Palestinians to accept maximalist Israeli positions that would be, and appeared intended to be, fatal to their cause. This initiative was coordinated closely with these regimes via the mediation of Presidential Envoy Extraordinaire Jared Kushner, Trump's son-in-law, also a real estate mogul, and an ardent extreme Zionist whose family also donated to Jewish settlements. In collusion with their Gulf partners at a June 2019 conference in Bahrain and in other venues, Kushner, Greenblatt, and Friedman publicly pushed what was essentially an economic development initiative for the West Bank and Gaza Strip, meant to operate under existing conditions of virtually complete Israeli control. Kushner cast doubt on the feasibility of independent Palestinian self-rule, saying, quote, we'll have to see, unquote. He drew on the classic colonialist lexicon to add, quote, the hope is that they over time can become capable of governing, unquote. All the Palestinians deserved, in Kushner's view, was, quote, the opportunity to live a better life, the opportunity to pay their mortgage, unquote. Jonathan Swan, quote, Kushner, for the first time, claims he never discussed security clearance with Trump, unquote. Axios, June 3rd, 2019. With their essentially economic solution, this troika displayed remarkable ignorance of a solid expert consensus that the Palestinian economy has been strangled primarily by the systematic interference of the Israeli military occupation that their plan meant to keep in place. The Trump administration exacerbated this economic stranglehold by cutting off U.S. aid to the PA and to UNRWA. The U.S. also continued to support Israel's blockade of Gaza, aided by Egypt, with its disastrous effects on 1.8 million people. The crucial political aspect of Trump's deal of the century was reportedly contained in the outlines of an American-Israeli proposal that the PA was presumed to accept. This reportedly involved creating a non-contiguous, non-sovereign entity without removal of any of the existing illegal Israeli settlements, which would be recognized, quote, legalized, unquote, and annexed to Israel. This entity would remain under false Israeli security control, which for Palestinians would reportedly have to pay, and therefore be a state in name only. It would exclude sovereignty or control over Jerusalem and be located in the Gaza Strip, and the scores of disparate fragments totaling under 40% of the West Bank that constitute areas A and B, with some parts of C perhaps to be included, but only subject to further negotiations. Quote, Palestine chief negotiator reveals details of Trump's peace plan, unquote. Middle East Monitor, January 22nd, 2018. Integrally linked to such an approach was Trump's December 2017 recognition of Jerusalem as Israel's capital, and the subsequent relocation of the U.S. Embassy there. This move marked a revolutionary departure from over 70 years of U.S. policy going back to the UNGA 181, whereby the status of the Holy City was to remain undetermined pending a final resolution of the Palestine question to be mutually agreed by both sides. This affront was then followed by Trump's proclamation recognizing Israeli sovereignty over the annexed Golan Heights, another radical U.S. policy shift. With these two pronouncements, the administration unilaterally took issues, one of which, that of Jerusalem, Israel is treaty-bound to negotiate with the Palestinians, off the table, as well as reversing decades of American policy. The Trump ensemble spurned an entire body of international law and consensus, UN Security Council decisions, world opinion, and of course Palestinian rights. Trump accepted fully Israel's stand on the vital issue of Jerusalem, and did so without any quid pro quo from Israel and without any acknowledgement of Palestinian demands for recognition of the city as the capital of Palestine. Equally important, by implication, Trump endorsed Israel's expansive definition of a, quote, unified Jerusalem, unquote, including the extensive Arab areas in and around the city appropriated by Israel since 1967. Although the administration stated that actual borders were still to be negotiated, its proclamation meant, in effect, that there was nothing left to negotiate. Through these and other actions, the White House implicitly confirmed the outlines of the American-Israeli proposal. It explicitly avoided endorsing a two-state solution. It closed the Palestinian mission in Washington, D.C., and the U.S. consulate in East Jerusalem that had served as an informal embassy to the Palestinians. It claimed that, contrary to the status of all other refugees since World War II, the descendants of Palestinians declared refugees in 1948 are not themselves refugees. Finally, by endorsing Israel's annexation of Jerusalem and the Golan Heights, Trump cleared the way for the annexation of whatever parts of the occupied West Bank Israel's should choose to swallow up. In exchange for these drastic derogations of Palestinian rights, the Palestinians were to be offered money collected from the Gulf monarchies. The offer was formalized at the June 2019 conference in Bahrain that the PA refused to attend. Kushner's proposal to buy off Palestinian opposition to a plan that obviated a negotiated political settlement was in fact no more than a reheated version of similar plans for, quote, economic peace, unquote, in lieu of rights peddled by Israeli leaders from Shimon Peres to Netanyahu. For Netanyahu and ultranationalist supporters of extremist settlers, an economic sweetener for the bitter pill the Palestinians were meant to swallow had become an essential plank in their explicitly annexationalist approach. Indeed, what was most striking about this White House's Middle East policy was that it had been effectively outsourced to Netanyahu and his allies in Israel and the United States. Its initiatives seem to have come prepackaged from the Israeli right's storehouse of ideas, moving the U.S. Embassy to Jerusalem, recognizing the annexation of the Golan, airily dispensing the Palestinian refugee issue, trying to liquidate UNRWA, and withdrawing from the Obama-era nuclear agreement with Iran. Only a few items remained on Netanyahu's wish list: annexation of much of the West Bank, formal American rejection of sovereign Palestinian statehood, the creation of a toothless Palestinian Quisling leadership, the entire package meant to coerce the Palestinians to accept that they are a defeated people. None of this was entirely new, given past American practice, but Trump's people abandoned even the shabby old pretense as impartiality. With this plan, the United States ceased to be Israel's lawyer, becoming instead the mouthpiece of the most extreme government in Israel's history, proposing to negotiate directly with the Palestinians on Israel's behalf, with the welcome assistance of its closest Arab allies. Perhaps the White House was up to something else, generating draft proposals that were so offensively pro-Israel as to be unacceptable to even the most compliant Palestinians. With this tactic, the Israeli government could paint the Palestinians as rejectionist and continue to avoid negotiations, while maintaining the status quo of creeping annexation, expanding colonization, and legal discrimination. In either case, the outcome would be the same. The Palestinians were put on notice that the prospect of an independent future in their homeland was closed off, and that the Israeli colonial endeavor had a free hand to shape Palestine as it wished. This is a conclusion that most of the world rejects, and it will surely be met with resistance, both locally and globally. It is also at odds with every principle of freedom, justice, and equality that the United States is supposed to stand for. A resolution imposed strictly on harsh Israeli terms will inevitably bring more conflict and insecurity for all concerned. For the Palestinians, though, it also presents opportunities. The existing strategies of both of the leading Palestinian political factions, Fatah and Hamas, have come to nothing, evidenced by the acceleration of Israeli control over all of Palestine. Neither dependence on U.S. mediation and fruitless negotiations as part of the sole resort to feeble diplomacy of the Abbas era, nor a nominal strategy of armed resistance has advanced Palestinian national aims over the past few decades. Nor is there much for the Palestinians to accept from Arab regimes like those of Egypt and Jordan, which today have no shame in signing massive gas deals with Israel or Saudi Arabia, and the UAE, which have purchased Israeli weapons and security systems through American cutouts that only thinly disguise their origins. Jonathan Furziger and Peter Waldman quote, "How do Israel's tech firms do business in Saudi Arabia?" Very quietly, unquote. Bloomberg Business Week, February 2nd, 2017. These realizations necessitate a careful reassessment by the Palestinians of their methods, whether their national goals are defined as an end to occupation and reversing the colonization of Palestinian land. Establishing a Palestinian state in the remaining 22% of mandatory Palestine, with Arab East Jerusalem as its capital, the return to their ancestral homeland of that half of the Palestinian people who are currently living in exile, or creating a democratic, sovereign binational state in all of Palestine with equal rights for all, or some combination or permutation of these options. As the weaker party in the conflict, the Palestinian side cannot afford to remain divided. But before unity can be achieved, a redefinition of objectives must take place on the basis of a new national consensus. It is a searing indictment of both Fatah and Hamas that in recent decades, civil society initiatives such as boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement and student activism have done more to further the Palestine cause than either of these two main factions had undertaken. A reconciliation would at least repair some of the damage caused by their split. But reconciliation between two ideological bankrupt political movements, important though it would be, cannot provide the dynamic new strategy needed to dislodge the Palestinian cause from its current state of stagnation and retreat. One key change that is needed involves acknowledging that diplomatic strategy adopted by the PLO since the 1980s was fatally flawed. The United States is not and cannot be a mediator, a broker, or a neutral party. It has long opposed Palestinian national aspirations and has formally committed itself to support the Israeli government's positions on Palestine. The Palestinian national movement must recognize the true nature of the American stance and undertake dedicated grassroots political and informational work to make its case inside the United States, as the Zionist movement has done for over a century. This task will not necessarily take generations, given the significant shifts that have already occurred in key sectors of public opinion. There is a great deal to build on. Yet the bifurcated Palestinian leadership today appears to have no better understanding of the workings of American society and politics than its predecessors had. It does not have an idea how to engage with American public opinion, and has made no serious attempt to do so. This ignorance of the complex nature of the U.S. political system has prevented the fashioning of a sustained program to reach potentially sympathetic elements of civil society. By contrast, in spite of the dominant position Israel and its supporters enjoy in the United States, they continue to expend lavish resources to advance their cause in public arena. Although the effort to support Palestinian rights is poorly funded and has been comprised only of initiatives by elements of civil society, it has achieved remarkable success in such spheres as the arts, notably cinema and theater. The legal realm, where defenders of free speech and the First Amendment have become vital allies against sustained attacks on supporters of BDS, sectors of academia, notably Middle East and American studies, some unions and churches, and key parts of the base of the Democratic Party. Similar work needs to be directed at Europe, Russia, India, China, Brazil, and non-aligned states. Israel has made progress in recent years in cultivating the elites and public opinion in these countries, while many of them, especially China and India, are becoming more active in the Middle East. Julien Boussu, quote, analyze l'on s'implante au Moyen-Orient, unquote, Le Monde, February 27, 2018, 21. Although most Arab states are controlled by undemocratic regimes subservient to the United States and desirous of Israeli approval, Arab public opinion remains acutely sensitive to the appeal of Palestine. Thus, in 2016, 75% of respondents in 12 Arab countries considered the Palestine cause one of concern to all Arabs, and 86% disapproved of Arab recognition of Israel because of its policies directed against Palestine. Quote, 2016 Arab Opinion Index Executive Summary, unquote, Arab Center, Washington, D.C., April 12, 2017. The Palestinians need to resurrect the PLO's former strategy of appealing over the heads of unresponsive regimes to sympathetic Arab public opinion. Most important is that should entering negotiations based on a Palestinian consensus become feasible, any future diplomacy must reject the Oslo interim formula and proceed on an entirely different basis. An intensive global public relations and diplomatic campaign must be aimed at demanding international sponsorship and rejecting exclusive U.S. control of the process, a demand that has already been feebly made by the PA. Beyond this, for the purpose of negotiations, the Palestinians ought to treat the United States as an extension of Israel, as a superpower. It would necessarily be represented at any talks, but it should be considered as an adversarial party, even seated with Israel, but it should be considered, let me reread this. Beyond this, for the purpose of negotiations, the Palestinians ought to treat the United States as an extension of Israel. As a superpower, it would necessarily be represented at any talks, but it should be considered as an adversarial party, even seated with Israel on the opposite side of the table, which would represent its real position at least since 1967. New negotiations would need to reopen all the crucial issues created by the 1948 war that were closed in Israel's favor in 1967 by UNSC 242, the 1947 UNGA 181 partition borders, and its Corpus Separatum proposal for Jerusalem, the return and compensation of refugees, and the political, national, and civil rights of Palestinians inside Israel. Such talks should stress complete equality for treatment of both peoples and be based on the Hague and Fourth Geneva Conventions, the United Nations Charter with its stress of national self-determination, and all relevant UN Security Council and General Assembly resolutions, not just those cherry-picked by the United States to favor Israel. The current administration in Washington and the Israeli government would, of course, never accept such terms. And so these would, for the moment, constitute impossible preconditions for negotiations. That is precisely the point. They are meant to move the goalposts away from formulas devised as advantageous to Israel. Continuing to negotiate on the existing deeply flawed basis can only entrench a status quo that is leading toward the final absorption of Palestine into the greater land of Israel. If a serious and sustained Palestinian diplomatic and public relations effort campaigned for such new terms aimed at reaching a just and equitable peace, many countries would be amenable to considering them. They might even be willing to challenge the half-century-long United States monopoly on peacemaking, a monopoly that has been crucial in preventing peace in Palestine. This is the core thesis of my book, Brokers of Deceit. A forgotten but essential element to the Palestinian political agenda is work inside Israel. Specifically, convincing Israelis that there is an alternative to the ongoing oppression of the Palestinians. This is a long-term process that cannot be dismissed as a form of, quote, normalizing, unquote, relations with Israel. Neither the Algerians nor the Vietnamese short-sightedly deny themselves the opportunity to convince public opinion in the home country of their oppressor of the justice for their cause, efforts that contributed measurably to their victory. Nor should the Palestinians. The Palestinian people, whose resistance to colonialism has involved an uphill battle, should not expect quick results. They have shown unusual patience, perseverance, and steadfastness in defending their rights, which is the main reason that their cause is still alive. It is now essential for all the elements in Palestinian society to adopt a considered long-term strategy, which means rethinking much that has been done in the past, understanding how liberation movements succeeded in altering an unfavorable balance of forces, and cultivating all possible allies in their struggle. Given an Arab world that is in a state of disarray, greater than at any other time since the end of World War I, and a Palestinian national movement that appears to be without a compass, it might seem that this is an opportune moment for Israel and the United States to collude with their autocratic Arab partners to bury the Palestine question, dispose of the Palestinians, and declare victory. It is not likely to be quite so simple. There there is the not inconsiderable matter of the Arab public, which can be fooled some of the time, but not all of the time, and that emerges with Palestinian flags flying whenever democratic currents rise against autocracy. As in Cairo in 2011 and in Algiers in the spring of 2019, Israel's regional hegemony depends in very large measure on the maintenance and power of undemocratic Arab regimes that will suppress such sentiment. However distant it may seem today, real democracy in the Arab world would be a grave threat to Israel's regional dominance and freedom of action. Just as important, there is also the popular resistance the Palestinians can be expected to continue to mount, whatever the shabby deal to which their discredited leaders may mistakenly assent. Though Israel is the nuclear regional hegemon, its domination is not uncontested in the Middle East, nor is the legitimacy of the undemocratic Arab regimes which are increasingly become its clients. Finally, the United States, for all its power, has played a secondary role, sometimes no role at all, in the crises in Syria, Yemen, Libya, and elsewhere in the region. It will not necessarily maintain the near monopoly over the Palestine question, and indeed over the entire Middle East, that it has enjoyed for so long. Configurations of global power have been changing. Based on their growing energy needs, China and India will have more to say about the Middle East in the 21st century than they did in the previous one. Being closer to the Middle East, Europe and Russia have been more affected than the United States by the instability there and can be expected to play larger roles. The United States will most likely not continue to have the free hand that Britain once did. Perhaps such changes will allow Palestinians, together with Israelis and others worldwide who wish for peace and stability with justice in Palestine, to craft a different trajectory than that of oppression of one people by another. Only such a path based on equality and justice is capable of concluding the 100 Years' War on Palestine with a lasting peace, one that brings with it the liberation that the Palestinian people deserve. Now, I missed a ton of notes, and I can't feasibly go back and fill them in. So if people want to stitch notes, that'd be cool. If you want to pick up the book, read it yourself, use the notes, that would be cool. I'm open to you receiving this book the way that the author intended it, and I apologize for botching that part of my read. In the future, I will make sure that I do this better. This was my first time doing this. I'm going to read some stuff on the back and then call it. This book presents the most cognate, comprehensive, and compelling account yet of this struggle from the Palestinian vantage point. No one who cares about the Middle East's central conflict can afford to ignore this perspective, and all policymakers need to grapple with its implications. That was a quote from Lisa Anderson, Foreign Affairs. The 100 Years' War on Palestine is one of the best researched general surveys of 20th and early 21st century Palestinian life, but it's also a deeply personal work. For a people whose history is all but criminalized, this act of retelling is itself a form of resistance. That is a quote from Khalim Hawa from The Nation. A stunning example of narrative history and academic rigor. That is a quote from Gareth Smith, Responsible Statecraft. And finally, informed and passionate, an elegy for the Palestinians. Matthew Hughes, The Guardian. Then I'm going to read this middle piece. In 1899, Yusuf Dia al-Khalidi, former mayor of Jerusalem, alarmed by the Zionist call to create a Jewish national home in Palestine, wrote a letter aimed at Theodore Herzl. The country had an indigenous people who would not easily accept their own displacement, He warned of the perils ahead, ending his note, quote, "In the name of God, let Palestine be left alone," unquote. Thus, Rashid Khalidi, al-Khalidi's great-great-nephew, begins this sweeping history, the first journal account of the conflict told from an explicitly Palestinian perspective. Accepted interpretations of the confrontation tend, at best, to describe a tragic clash between two peoples with claims to the same land, drawing on archival materials and the accounts of generations of family members, judges, scholars, diplomats, and journalists. The 100 Years of War in Palestine instead shows that this war has always been colonial in nature, waged against the native population first by the Zionist movement and then by Israel, but backed by Britain and the United States, the great powers of the age. Neither a chronicle of victimization nor a whitewash of mistakes made by Palestinian leaders, the 100 Years War on Palestine offers both a compelling family history and an original, illuminating view of the Middle East's most intractable conflict. Rashid Khalidi is the author of 8 books, among them Palestinian Identity, Brokers of Deceit, and Iron Cage, The Iron Cage. His writing has appeared in the New York Times and the New York Review of Books. Among many other publications, he is the Edward Said Professor of Modern Arab Studies at Columbia University in New York and co-editor of the Journal of Palestine Studies. Thank you for being here. Have a great one. I'm not sure what the next book is going to be. There's a lot that I want to consider first, but look for it. Thanks for coming. Appreciate you. Cheers.